So usually they'll just blame it on the saturated fat because kind of like how, cholesterol is blamed for heart disease, even though there's a lot of things that you could say are causing it. It's just people have accepted that it's causing it. So they'll have an experiment and they'll show, oh, look, this high fat diet caused diabetic-like symptoms in rats. So it's the saturated fat. And they won't even bother to do some type of control group or other treatment group that has the same amount of fat, but without, the high PUFA component. And there's just hundreds of papers like that just claim they're not actually asking the question, is saturated fat causing this problem? They're asking the question, is the type of fat we used in our experiment causing this problem? And they don't even really discuss exactly what the components are. And sometimes they even report it factually incorrectly, which, maybe I should, because you can get papers retracted if people make it.
Wow, that'd be cool if you got some paper retracted.
Eat human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est o apogeo.
ピーク人間
O melhor humano.
Hello. Welcome back to the show. Start back at episode 1 to get all of the info. Go to nosetotale.org to check out all our whole food meat products and sapien.org to check out our programs. Today's show is very interesting. It's with Kyle Mamounis, PhD, who has his doctorate in nutritional sciences and is doing postdoc work in biochemistry at the University of Central Florida. He's a really interesting guy. He went from raw vegan to raw meat. He ate a raw meat diet with organs for years. He has some interesting ideas about nutrition that are a bit different than you normally hear, but really fall in line with the sapien diet. I think it's important to talk to people on different sides of things, and he has some interesting ideas on people who do low carb diets for too long and may develop some problems. Maybe they are cold, maybe they wake up in the middle of the night. If some women lose their period, some people have thyroid problems. Maybe it's okay to add some carbs back in. Oh my, how crazy. It's good to look at all sides of science, like I always say. And we also talk about nutrition science and how hard it is to do. We talk about PUFAs. He's really against these high omega-6 seed oils, against fortified foods, especially the ones with iron, and talks about how they drive the metabolic disease process and insulin resistance. It starts out kind of in the weeds, so stick with us, get through it. It gets better and better as we go. I think it's really important to listen to this type of thing to change your viewpoint, even though he actually does really align with a good sapien whole foods diet based on animal foods. So strap in for this one. I enjoyed talking to him. He's a cool guy, very nice guy. Last week I talked about all the Nose to Tail products. Today I'm going to talk about the Sapien stuff. Our Sapien tribe, we have a live breathwork class with this great guy from Toronto that does guided breathwork. I'm just starting to get into this, seeing what it's all about. We're going to do it live with the tribe on Zoom next week. So join the tribe. You get all the perks there, show notes, bonus episodes, private forum, cool stuff like the Zoom calls with Dr. Gary or this one with special guests doing cool things, and we all learn from each other. We also have the program where you can get all the info on how to implement a sapien diet in your life, how to change your life, how to go beyond just information and figure out the details to make it suit you and your lifestyle. And we have health coaches ready and waiting for you. So go to sapien.org. You can scroll down to the tribe. You can scroll down to the program. You can join there. We're still doing our discount for both of those. Get it while you can because we're not going to have this discounted price forever. Also subscribe to the Sapien podcast. I do a lot of podcasts with Dr. Gary, and we do some great video podcasts with in-person guests that do not come out on this platform. They don't come out on Peak Human. You have to subscribe to the Sapien podcast or get them on the Food Lies YouTube channel. Also, I mentioned Nose to Tail a few times in this episode, the products we offer there. Great way to get organs and great way to get low omega-6 PUFAs in your meat, especially the pork and chicken. So go to nosetotale.org and enjoy this episode with Kyle Mamounis, PhD. All right, we're live with Kyle Mamounis. How are you doing over there in Florida?
I'm okay. How are you?
I'm good, man. I've been brushing up on your work. And yeah, I think I was just saying before we started that I didn't like to have people it was just 100% in line with my thinking on my show all the time. And we probably do overlap on most things. And maybe there's some things we don't overlap on and we can get into them. But why don't you tell us about your background, your career, your research, stuff like that?
All right. Well, professionally, I did a bachelor's in biology, and then I worked in labs for a few years, and then went to graduate school, did a PhD in nutritional science at Rutgers, and I ended up doing a project on it was in an endocrinology lab that studied estrogen and estrogen receptor. And I was able to use the tools there, and I did the diet manipulation with mice and fed mice just regular, like the regular kind of lab mice that are mostly used in metabolic studies and stuff, high fat diets of either mostly saturated fat or mostly omega-6 polyunsaturated fat, and then one in the middle, and looked for differences in like weight gain, fat mass, insulin resistance, and glucose metabolism. And then also with molecular biology, gene expression of inflammatory proteins in the hypothalamus that have to do with like appetite regulation and metabolic regulation, and also insulin resistance and leptin signaling and all that kind of stuff.
That's awesome. I mean, every single one of those we should talk about. Those are all super interesting and important. And it's cool that you're doing that research. I heard that you were trying to find a high fat, saturated fat diet, and it was hard to even do because all the rat chow was actually high in PUFA.
Yeah, well, it's hard to control it because you have to use coconut oil, because all the animal fats have different amounts of like omega-6 and omega-3. So if you want everything to be like, it gets tricky. And I was working with this company called Research Diets, and that's what they do is they come up with these formulations to help you best like, ask your specific experimental questions. So like, if you're targeting this percentage omega-6, you can't just use, say, soybean oil, because soybean oil actually contains more omega-3 per omega-6 than some of the like canola or safflower, and then canola has more monounsaturated fat. So it actually gets kind of tricky, but that's the difference between like you'd think you could just feed mice like, okay, this vegetable oil diet here, and then this like more whole foods animal diet there, but it gets difficult if you're trying to do statistics and look at the effects of specific types of fats to have overlap. So it was a little bit tricky, but it was okay. Also, you can't go too high with coconut oil because of the medium and shorter chain fatty acids. It starts to get not as solid. And also with the PUFA. So I think I used 45% fat calories per, and some people use 60 for high fat. And that's usually with lard. And lard is like the worst because lard is just high in everything. Modern lard, it's like, it's almost equivalent like saturated, monounsaturated, and poly. Well, it used to be, but now that they feed pigs so much more grains, and I think they give them straight up vegetable oil now to fatten them up. So they have their monounsaturated has gone down. Like wild pigs, if you get like a wild boar or something and it's just eating an omnivorous diet, it'll be mostly saturated and monounsaturated fat. Whereas like the commercial pigs, they're more a third. So if you use that, you're not really looking at anything in particular. You're just looking at fat in general. So that's part of the challenge. But coconut oil is good because it's like 92% saturated fat or something. But then people could say, oh, well, you're looking specifically at shorter chain saturated fats. What if it was tallow, beef tallow or something? It's like, you can't ask every question all at once in one project.
It's hard. I mean, we should talk about the limits of scientific studies and all this type of stuff at some point in this discussion. But yeah, before we move too far away from this, what did you find with that study?
Well, I had a couple papers that I was using as foundations for what I was doing. And one of them was from a guy, the head of the lab was Joe Hibblen, Hibblen. And at the time, I don't know if he still is doing this, but at the time he was working for the Navy. and he was in like a psych department, and he was doing science on omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acid ratios and effects on psychology for the military. Like if, people chronically have a really high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, that it could cause like psychological problems. And so this was relevant to the military. And then he ended up kind of having scientists work under him that did it more on like a health, sometimes like there'll be somebody that has a lab and they'll have a certain thing they do, and then other people will work with them and take it in a different direction. And so he did an experiment with somebody where he fed similar diets, the saturated fat and then high saturated fat and then high omega-6 saturated fat and then high omega-6 saturated fat with omega-3. And he actually, for whatever reason, the mice that he fed the high coconut oil, high saturated fat diet to, they didn't really get fat at all. And the ones that had the omega-6 got fat and had other symptoms of metabolic issues. And then the omega-3 helped them a little bit. So I wanted to mimic that, except just compare the saturated fat and the omega-6 and do my stuff with the hypothalamic inflammation gene expression. But when I did it, and maybe I thought I used the same strain of mice. They are susceptible to getting fat and to getting diabetic type symptoms, but all of my mice got fat. So, so the ones that I fed a lot of coconut oil, a lot of basically vegetable oil, and then a mix, they all got fat. There were small differences. The coconut oil group was a little bit less fat. But the big difference was the glucose metabolism. So I had a male group, and I think in that group, the glucose disposal was really messed up in the ones that were fed the high vegetable oil diet. And it was pretty good. It was pretty close to the control group, which was fed like a more normal low fat diet with the coconut oil. And then I had a group of female mice, because the lab I was in was an estrogen lab. So part of my project was I fed these diets to male mice and did all of the assays on them. And then I took female mice and I surgically removed their ovaries. And half of them I gave replacement estrogen to every day. And the other half I just left without any of, ovarian produced hormones. And so normally that would make these female mice more susceptible to being fat and stuff without their natural steroid production. And in that case, with the female mice, I think what was perturbed the most was insulin resistance. So I would take the mice, have them fasted in the morning and give them all a dose of insulin per gram of lean mass and see how much it knocked down their blood glucose for how long. So I'd have them all in a box, give them each an injection of insulin, grab them, nick their tail, get a drop of blood with a glucometer, look at their glucose and then look at it after 20 minutes and another 20 minutes. And the normal response is that the insulin will knock down their glucose quite a bit, and then it'll stay depressed for a while and then it'll come back. And if it doesn't knock it down, then that's insulin resistance, compared to the other one. So in that case, the vegetable oil type fats caused more insulin resistance in the female mice than the coconut oil. So that was my main finding.
Cool. Well, so what is your take on, I guess we can just jump high level because we dove down pretty deep right away. But people listening will know my take on diet. I call it Sapien Framework, which is just kind of like a very general sense of what all diets have in common and what all diets leave out. But maybe you could share a little more higher level stuff on what your view so far through your research and whatever other people's research that you've looked at about, say, specifically these type of fats and I guess the cause of insulin resistance, if we want to jump into that whole big thing.
Yeah. So the reason why I picked this topic and the reason why I still think it's important, and it's starting to get quite a bit of attention, it'll probably continue to grow from here for a little while. It doesn't seem like it's peaked yet. The kind of omega-6 vegetable oil PUFA thing. A lot of people are talking about that. And let's see, I started this project in 2012. So it was being talked about, but more on the more like cutting edge forums and stuff where really like health nerdy people are talking about stuff that is going to become more popular 10 or 15 years later.
Yeah.
So my take was I looked at Dietary Changes, and I was kind of looking for like, oh, what kind of experimental question can I ask that hasn't been asked that much? And everybody was sort of going along with the increased intake in sugar corresponding to metabolic issues. And I was just looking at the timeline and trying to get nice data sets. There's a couple of papers that I cite in things I've written that have decent data sets. And it looked to me like the best, if you were to just take like one change, one type of food change that occurred over the entire population, and that was pretty well in line with when a lot of the metabolic syndrome type diseases started to creep into the population, and then also increased together consistently, would be vegetable oil. That kind of came about pretty much in the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th, and then really ramped up after World War II, and then maybe ramped up one last time like in the 80s. There was kind of that burst of kind of the end of home cooking as like the standard for everybody, you know, and a lot of store-bought stuff, a lot of processed packaged stuff, and like salad dressing. Like every salad dressing is basically just some type of vegetable oil with seasoning, like, you know, a sugar, like vinegar or whatever, or if it's a creamy one. I mean, and, you know, soups. If you just look at labels, it's just everywhere. And so it looks to me like that actually matched up better with these types of metabolic diseases, their incidence and increase in the population, than sugar or corn syrup or any of that stuff, which matches up a little bit, but there's a few inconsistencies. Like sugar intake did start earlier. Like I guess it's really hard to say because, you know, wealthy people had access to it first, like in the 1800s and even the 1700s. But things like, you know, the heart disease issues and type 2 diabetes, it seems like they really started in the 20th century, and they keep going up, even though, as far as I know, sugar intake has kind of plateaued since the end of it.
Yeah. So I've kind of teased this out doing the film, where it's not just, it's not just like sugar, refined carbs, or refined grains. It could be part of the problem. And I wanted to bring up my little graphic I did that my kind of coworker Dan sent you with the hammer and the nail, and just to explain it to people. My idea, after, you know, looking at all these different sides of things, is the seed oil. Yeah, these seed oils are the hammer just driving disease, and then you have these refined sugars or refined grains and sugar as a nail. And it's like it's this energy toxicity created by, well, over consuming them, not in the, you know, correct amount, quote correct amount. You know, you can have these, but we're over consuming them as a society, and then you have these seed oils, and it's just this bad combination. But specifically, if you tease out the different, well, especially these three ingredients, sugar does actually start to decline in the last 10 years because people kind of realized, oh yeah, we're eating too much sugar. It's not good for you. But the seed oils have been on the rise the whole time. And yes, they far better correlate with the rise in disease. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So that's kind of the big thing that I worked on for a while. And then, I guess my second big idea that I wanted to work on was, because after I did all that, I presented some of that at the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2013. It's like a paleo conference.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still going on. I guess maybe
it was last year. I mean, other than COVID, yeah. I mean, it was still going.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then I started, as I was doing this project and, you know, writing out my dissertation and everything, I did a really deep dive into the literature of metabolism and all this stuff. And I was really trying to hammer down like the specific physiological mechanism where say glucose or sucrose or fructose causes something like insulin resistance. And I was really coming up a little short. It seemed like what started to occur to me was that the consumption of those types of energy macronutrients was more, I mean, there's probably differences genetically across populations, you know, and some people are more, would have a macronutrient balance that's more optimal for them. But it seemed like what was happening is there was a kind of, it was almost like a probe, like your ability to consume either sugar or glucose through starches and things like that are kind of indicative of your glucose metabolic health. Like if you can consume those things and have a normal response where your blood sugar goes up and then it pretty quickly comes back down and you're not chronically having high blood sugar and high insulin, that's almost, it's like that. It's like those things are testing your system. And of course, if you were to force feed yourself something, and there are tolerances with things like fructose, like there's doses of fructose you can take that just mess up your gut because only so much can be digested at a certain time. And there's a lot of nuance to it. But basically at a population level, it seems like what was happening was not that, and it really reminded me of in the 70s, the thing with first cholesterol and then saturated fat causes heart disease because cholesterol is found in atherosclerotic plaques, and all of those things are sort of involved in whatever disease processes cause atherosclerosis and cause cardiovascular issues. But it's much more complicated than saying that, you know, cholesterol causes heart disease. And so I started to feel that way about sugar, or however, when I say sugars, usually I just mean carbs, kind of a shorthand, but like sugar causes insulin resistance. So I gave a couple talks about that. Also at the Ancestral Health Symposium 2016 and then 2017. The 2016 one, everybody seemed to like. And the 2017 one was,
What was the 2017 one? What was it different?
Actually, the 2016 one was about being a fat burner. And so I talked about the metabolic processes that shift your body towards using more and more fats and less dietary carbohydrate for metabolism, and how some of those are kind of mimic or mirror disease processes like stress hormones and stuff. And then I also had a section where I talked specifically about PUFA and how if you're going to have chronically high elevated free fatty acids, and a lot of those are polyunsaturated, that seems like could cause a lot of issues, especially if you have, you know, like a bunch of iron around and inflammation and stuff like that. It's just going to start to break down in the tissues and produce metabolites that are known to be bad. And then the 2017 talk was specifically about sugar and insulin resistance. And I think it kind of went over everybody's head. It was kind of a funny talk. I tried to make it funny, and sometimes that doesn't work right. I gave like my take on the best argument for why sugar causes insulin resistance. And then I gave a refutation of it. So at the same time, so I kind of like had a mini debate with myself.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that was a little bit more harder to grasp for the audience.
Well, maybe, well, they weren't ready for it. The world wasn't ready for that model or that paradigm anyway, right? Now it's more popular. I mean, a lot of the content I listen to is more focused on the harms of the high omega-6 seed oil type of thing.
Yeah, well, I think the reaction that I got, and that I get most of the time, is that people will just say, oh, well, I, you know, treated or alleviated or whatever my type 2 diabetic type symptoms by cutting out carbohydrate. And that's definitely something that can happen, but that doesn't mean, like, there's a lot of things that you can do to alleviate a disease state, like cutting something out, adding something, changing your lifestyle. And it doesn't always mean that the cause of the disease state was a lack of the change that you made.
Yeah.
And that can be really hard, especially when somebody, you know, cures themselves of something. They have a deep emotional attachment to, this is the thing that caused my issues before was the thing that I changed, which may or may not be true.
Well, yeah, and it makes sense. But I'm always trying to look at all sides and not and understand and meet people where they are and get it and be like, I understand these people and I've found great benefits from cutting carbs as well. And so a lot of people, it's just finally they found something that works for them and that helped them not eat too much energy or, and have these problems. And it's a perfectly good solution. So I don't like when people will maybe attack them for, or like make them feel stupid for thinking that way when it did work for them or it did address the problem. Or, well, there's also many other things of the psychological and mental side to eating, right? And some people in the really evidence-based world, they're just talking about the literature and they don't account for real life scenarios. So we're kind of jumping around all over the place, but what oh man, I don't want to jump around even more, but you brought up the iron thing that I wanted to talk about what do you think happens with insulin resistance? How does it start, and how does the omega-6s and the iron get involved?
That's a big question. I think there's a few. I look at it as candidate causes, because in terms of like the molecular mechanism of how insulin resistance happens, it seems like there's a few ways that you can induce this, like if you did this on the cellular level. And so one of them is, the simplest one is just the competition between using fatty acids and using glucose as fuel, which is called the Randall cycle. And that's just a very basic principle. And it's not even really a disease state. It's just, if you have fatty acids in a cell and they're being oxidized in the mitochondria, their products will tend to inhibit high use of glucose and vice versa. And this is generally accepted as just a way for cells to not have a futile cycle where they're using the one fuel and then maybe making the other one and then using the other one, and at cross purposes. Like even bacteria do this, where if you have certain bacteria, like something simple like E. coli in a petri dish, and you put a bunch of glucose on the petri dish, it'll preferentially use that even if there's a little bit of another sugar. Whereas if it's mostly a different sugar like lactose and not so much glucose, it'll preferentially use up the lactose, which makes sense. Use what's most available and not just waste the thing that's more scarce. So what seems to be the disease state in that situation is when people can't regulate their blood sugar and free fatty acids. So they have sort of chronically elevated free fatty acids, like the hormones, their state is telling their fat cells to liberate fatty acids, get them into the bloodstream, get them into cells to use as energy. While there is also glucose in the blood that is not being used as much as it could because of the fatty acids, and there's just a miscommunication there. So that's kind of a big picture thing. But what exactly causes that dysregulation gets really complicated, and zooming in all the way to the cell itself and insulin receptor. If you Google like insulin receptor, all of these proteins with cell receptors, they have a network of proteins that they then signal through. It's usually called like a signaling cascade, and it allows the body to pick up a big signal from a small concentration of hormone. So instead of having the pancreas or whatever gland produce a bunch of hormones to go out to the cells and signal for them to do things, it produces, say, a nanomolar concentration in the blood, and then that gets picked up by cells. And when the insulin receptor picks up the insulin signaling, it causes a powerful effect in the cell because it gets amplified by other proteins that spread this message. So it's basically like an amplifier, like for a sound system. And there are inflammatory proteins like cytokines and other things that can be in the cell or in the blood, get into the cell or interact with the insulin receptors or other receptors, leptin receptors, that can get in the way of those signal amplifying proteins, usually by phosphorylating them or dephosphorylating them. That's usually the normal way that proteins get turned on or off in cells, is they have a phosphate attached or taken off. And changes their shape. And that's generally the sort of recognized model for how these things get turned up or down. And so, yeah, if you have an inflammatory state, even if there's a lot of insulin and it's hitting the insulin receptor and telling the cell that there's insulin, the cell doesn't have the proper amplification system to sufficiently communicate to the hardware in the nucleus and, you know, expressing genes and doing all the cellular metabolism things to say, oh, we have insulin, which means we have glucose, which means we can use this glucose. We can, you know, ramp up metabolism, synthesize more proteins, produce thyroid hormone, all the kinds of things that the different cells in the different tissues would say to do when you have an abundance of glucose. But actually what produces that state is, I mean, it's not fully understood. And as far as iron goes, iron does a lot of things. It's necessary, to carry oxygen in the blood. And because it's so necessary, unfortunately, the body is super thrifty with it. So we don't lose a lot of iron. And you can imagine, like in the past, if you didn't have a lot of iron available, or you had a cut and you lost a lot of blood, you have to be thrifty with this iron because you just can't get below a certain amount, or else your red blood cells can't transport oxygen and you just can't make it. But we don't have that problem now. You know, we can stop our bleeding pretty easily. We have pretty consistent abundance to dietary iron. And it's also fortified in foods, the grain supply in particular. And because of that, most people probably have too much iron, and you have a certain amount of iron carrying proteins in the blood and iron storage proteins in different tissues that will sequester the iron that isn't complexed with proteins like hemoglobin and other proteins that use it as a cofactor for their chemistry. And when you exceed that, you can get free iron floating around. And that is a good catalyst for oxygen to attack polyunsaturated fatty acids. So if these two things are both in the blood at the same time, and that initiates the oxidation sort of cascade where they can oxidize and then oxidize each other, and it produces a whole other slew of issues that is at least partially, if not the main cause of some of the inflammatory states that cause the insulin resistance I was just trying to describe.
Yeah. And then go specific into this iron, though, because there's different forms of iron. And you mentioned there's heme iron, in meat, people know about, but then you're talking about the bad iron is probably the fortified iron that we're throwing into grains. Or just go into more about the different, or even like iron, say iron in spinach. So maybe we could talk about each type of iron.
Yeah. So iron, it's a metal, and it does a lot of important chemistry because it can exist in a lot of different states. So it's usually oxidized at some level, like +3, +4, +2. And the really oxidized iron is what people will see sometimes as rust. And that's, if it comes in contact with water and oxygen, it'll become highly oxidized and it'll get that red color. And that's bad. You don't want that kind of iron, like +4, because it's really reactive. And the iron that they put in, unfortunately, with the grain supply, I think it's a bad idea to fortify foods like that anyway, because there's really no good evidence for a population-wide intervention like that. Like, there may be some people that need more iron, but that's like on a very person-to-person basis. Even with the B vitamins, it's not a great idea, I think, to fortify, but that's less dangerous in most cases. But the iron's really bad. And what makes it even worse is they just use elemental, like iron filings. So just like metal iron, and just put it into the grain supply. And
what could go wrong? No.
Yeah. And this, I haven't looked into this for a while, but there was a big internet blog post. I forget what website it was, but they were looking into the effects of iron like that in the gut. And it's a whole other thing with because iron is a very limiting mineral for bacteria. Bacteria are very covetous of iron, and they will send out proteins, whether it's in your gut or like in nature, on a slimy rock or whatever where bacteria are. They will send out proteins to grab iron and bring it back to them because it's so necessary for their metabolism, even more than ours. They use a lot of iron bound proteins. And so just introducing a bunch of free iron into the gut, it seems to also, even just outside of the question of when it gets into your blood and then can cause the increase the rate of oxidation of susceptible fatty acids, the polyunsaturated long chain types, in the gut, it's going to alter the microbiome, and probably not in a good way.
Yeah. Well, okay. So that's a fortified iron. Is there a difference? What about, like, say, iron in like a plant food and iron in animal food?
So the heme iron in animal foods, it's coming packaged in the heme protein. And what's nice about that is that the bacteria can't get to it as easily. So you'll absorb the heme iron. We actually seem to be, and this is a pretty good evidence that people are supposed to eat meat. I always used to say this when I first switched over from like a vegetarian and vegan to eating meat. One of the big things was that heme iron is absorbed in the human gut like 100 times better than iron in plant foods like spinach. And it's like, it seems to suggest that that meat is something that we're adapted to consume. So, but because it's so efficient at absorbing, you can have a lot of just dietary iron from eating meat. So it's better in the gut sense, but even when you absorb the heme iron, it'll eventually just end up in your body's iron pool. Usually everything pretty much always goes through the liver first. So things go from the gut right into the blood, get through the liver. The liver's takes whatever it wants. It kind of has first pass. So it'll take a certain amount of iron, store it, put it into proteins and all kinds. So it just enters the iron pool. And it's the same thing with plant iron. The only difference is the plant iron is absorbed less well because it's not packaged in this little bit of a protein. So a heme is sort of the active site of a protein like hemoglobin, or there are plant versions of those too, but they're shaped a little bit differently, and we're just adapted to absorbing that little molecule really well. And the other thing with plant iron, like spinach, is if it's raw, there's a lot of minerals that will sometimes block its absorption and block the absorption of other metals, chelating them electrically so that they are sort of surrounded with different types of phosphate molecules. And I'm not actually sure if bacteria can get at that, or if that just gets sort of spit out of the system, out of the gut. But it's less efficient anyway. So if you wanted to get iron from plants, you should probably cook them.
So maybe we should really zoom out here. What? Because I don't want to lose people. Maybe we already lost people. If you're still around, thank you for staying here.
Let's bring them back.
Yeah. Look, reel it in. Maybe if you turned it off, well, you can't hear us anyway. So, what's your take on diet? So you said you at one point were following a vegetarian diet. I don't know how far you went with that. And then what is your kind of higher level views of diet and how to stay healthy?
Okay, so I went through a bunch of diets. I started with regular vegetarianism in college when I was about 19, and then I got on the internet, and I'm just a curious guy. So when you start doing vegetarianism, and that's kind of a funny diet because it mixes and matches health claims with morality claims. So there's people that do it's kind of a mixed bag. It's like people would say, oh, well, it's really good for you. And then, but a lot of those claims are kind of mixed up with and it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So it has a very powerful driving force when there's kind of nothing opposing it. Because for a lot of people, you just grow up, maybe your family doesn't have a specific dietary philosophy, eat a lot of junk food, whatever. And the first thing that you're exposed to seems really, it's very impressive because it's like, oh, okay, somebody that knows something, even if the things they know are actually factually incorrect.
But it sounds good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Better than junk food. You're like, oh, wow, I feel so great. I ate a salad or something.
Yeah. So I got pretty hardcore. I was doing vegetarian and I used to lift weights in high school and college. I actually lost like quite a bit of muscle when I first did that because I did not understand protein and even calories. Like I would just eat things that were not meat.
Yeah.
And then from there, I started learning about veganism and then raw veganism, which is very kind of religious culty in its practice. And I got into that and was pretty much a true believer for 2, maybe close to 3 years. And I lost a lot of weight because I still didn't really know about protein and calories, if I could have even gotten enough with a raw vegan diet anyway, without just eating like, a bunch of nuts and seeds all the time. And then from there, I spent a lot of time and so just for context, this was in my early 20s. So I was basically healthy. I didn't have any health problems and I wasn't really trying to address any health problems. I was just super curious and kind of obsessed with the idea of what's the best diet and what's the perfect diet, almost in an abstract sense. And then I was on online forums talking about this stuff. And it's a really funny experience because there's people on there that are trying to address real health issues. And then there were people like me that were just kind of nerdy, interested about it. And then I started hearing from raw food people the idea of eating raw animal products, some simple stuff like just eating like raw eggs or raw egg yolks, cheese made from unpasteurized milk, and then unpasteurized milk itself, and then even raw meat. And then I got into, I don't know if you know Agenus Vonderplanets. Yeah. So I did that. I've transitioned, and pretty much immediately this was the first time I changed my diet and had an improvement. So everything I had done before, not that I felt that bad because I was young and I was pretty healthy from the starting point, and I hadn't been doing it for years and years to really hit any kind of serious deficiencies. And I did take B12 and things like that because I was aware of some of the more common pitfalls of vegan diets and things like that. But I was losing weight and I could not gain it back. And so then I added some unpasteurized cheese to my diet. I would just make a big salad and maybe have like, avocados and all kinds of vegetable stuff. And then just like a block from a Whole Foods, because that was the only place you could get it back then, of some unpasteurized cheese. And I immediately gained like 10 pounds.
In a good way.
Yeah. And I was like, okay, this is cool. I did that for a while. Then I started drinking raw milk and making like big milkshakes with like unheated honey and eggs and raw milk and eating meat again. And then I started discovering the paleo sphere. This would have been 2007-ish. So things online were pretty, like, I think YouTube existed, but it was way different than, even years ago. I mean, it was actually just people making videos, and it was very amateurish and all that. So I got into paleo, and I went back and forth with different things, because one of the problems with paleo is it's a very wide, a lot of different things could be called paleo. It's basically just don't eat, fairly novel foods. There's a little bit of a debate, I guess, over the dairy question, like whether, you can consume milk and call that paleo. But eventually, because again, I'm a little obsessive and nerdy about this stuff, I found a forum called Raw Paleo Forum, and for about 2 years ate a diet that was primarily raw meat and, organs and stuff like that. And that's what I was doing when I started graduate school. So I was going to graduate school to get a PhD in nutritional science and bringing like containers of raw meat to class and to eat for lunch, like in the lab and stuff.
That's awesome.
And people would ask me about it. It gets pretty old. People always think it's interesting. And for the first year, if you're doing a weird diet, it's kind of fun to talk about. And then after a while, you just want to be left alone if you have weird food.
Yeah. How did that go though? How did you feel?
Well, I felt pretty good. This is when, so I had gained a lot of weight back and was able to like put on a little bit of muscle, at least from working out. But then I was really experimenting with cutting out carbs a lot. And I did start to run into a couple issues with energy. A lot of times I would skip breakfast. Usually I would skip breakfast. So I would do sort of an intermittent fast from the nighttime until lunch. And then I would eat a mostly meat and fat lunch. And then the same thing for dinner. And I did notice that if I, for example, like worked out really hard in the morning, sometimes I would get a really bad headache, like a migraine, probably because I was just dipping too much into liver glycogen and, just cause some sort of chain reaction issue. And I started getting a little bit cold sometimes, especially when between meals, like I would just feel cold. And that's when I started being exposed to the sort of Ray Peat sphere ideas of metabolic rate and all that kind of stuff. And at one point, I just decided to try. I was spending a lot of time studying and grading papers and all kinds of graduate student stuff at a Barnes & Noble Starbucks. And I just started buying coffee drinks there that had like milk and sugar in them. And sometimes even eating sort of the junk food they have there, like a stuffed pretzel, just because I didn't feel like going home to eat my normal food. And I actually felt a lot better. Like I would feel warm and my mood would improve. So then I started adding carbohydrates back in, started cooking food, and got, started going almost towards like a normal person diet. Just, a healthy version of that. And then I'm always experimenting with stuff, but as of now, I don't really do an extreme, I don't really keep my fat intake low, my carb intake low. I try to get enough protein. I try to get glycine. I focus on that, like the protein, the amino acids and collagen. And yeah, so I was at this point after all this time. So from the age of about 19 to 20, and now I'm 36, I've kind of become almost agnostic on diet and almost feel like at this point, I guess I know the most about nutrition and nutritional science as I ever have. And I feel the least confident in being like, well, this is definitely what you should do. And this is definitely what I'm going to be doing for the foreseeable future.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that kind of happens, right? It's a Dunning-Kruger effect and stuff like that.
Right.
But it sounds like you went through the whole gamut. You went through the extremes. It's really interesting to go raw vegan and raw meat and back around to balanced quote diets. And yeah, it's super interesting. I think, well, yeah, it's good for people to experiment, and it's good for scientists to admit when they don't know things. And, well, so then what are the things that you would avoid based on your research? We talked about seed oils. We talked about too much iron. I mean, what does that practically mean to people? I mean, with this iron thing?
Well, it's a nice thing about the seed oils is they're pretty easy to avoid if you just avoid them. So like, you can't just eat regular salad dressing and, like the cheap cream of mushroom soup and stuff like that at the store, because those are pretty much all made with vegetable oils. But it's once you get an idea of what products those things are in, you just don't use those products and, make your own salad dressing. I mean, it's easy. It's pretty much, it's easy fixes. The iron thing, the iron, that's a little tough because you basically can't, I think if you wanted to eat bread and you didn't want to get fortified iron, you basically have to bake your own, and you have to get organic flour because for whatever reason, I think the legal structure in America forces the manufacturers of flour for baking to use fortified sources. And I guess organic manufacturers don't have to. So that's one thing you can do. I personally don't feel too much of an effect from, like, I'll eat bread once in a while, not too often. I've been eating a lot of corn tortilla. That's actually like a pretty easy and pretty safe starch. If somebody wanted to add starches into their diets, it doesn't, sometimes you can find them, it's just corn and water and lime. Sometimes they have some gums in there, which some people are sensitive to, but I don't really see that I'm bothered by it. And if you are a man, I would suggest that you look into phlebotomy for, well, first you could get blood work done and look at your iron, but it's actually it's pretty hard to be deficient in iron unless you have some type of issue these days, just because the intakes are so high. It's so easy to get sources of iron like meat. And it's probably a good idea. And like, if you wanted to donate blood and stuff like that, to kind of get on a regular schedule for that, because one of the stronger pieces of science that is pretty reproducible is that females of reproductive age are much more resistant to cardiovascular disease and not quite as resistant to metabolic syndrome type diseases as men, but a little bit more. And then when they hit menopause, that resistance goes away. So it seems like the blood loss, right?
The monthly period, yeah. And then just to make sure people know, phlebotomy means giving blood. So
right, yeah, it just means
so if you're not,
blood being taken out of your with a needle.
Exactly, it's a technical process that happens. So not having too much iron. Do you still eat organ meats? Do you eat raw organ meats?
Oh yeah. I'm a big liver proponent. I'm a proponent of all kinds of organ meats, but liver is really the best bang for your buck. And I think it's pretty versatile. There's a lot of people don't like the taste, and I'm definitely sympathetic to that, but I think you just got to get over it and figure out how to cook it. I made a YouTube video on how to cook it so that it doesn't taste that bad. If you sear it, and then just cook it lightly, but sear it quickly on the outside, it makes a kind of crust that tastes fairly well. If you buy it frozen or something, you don't want to let it sit around for a while before you cook it. You want to cook it right away. Dry it.
Soaking it in buttermilk or something. I've heard that one.
I've heard of that. I've tried that before, and it probably takes away some of the bitter flavors. But I found if you just get it fresh, pat it dry, and then so the drying helps with the searing process, and just try to cook it as fresh as possible. It's really not that bad. And if you have it with foods that are flavorful, a lot of times you really won't notice it. Sometimes there's pieces in the liver that have like a connective-y type texture, and you can just cut those out if you don't like weird textures in your foods. A lot of people, it bothers them when their meat and stuff doesn't have a consistent texture.
Yeah.
Other organs, like, they can get sort of challenging. I mean, kidneys, one of the worst things I ever ate was raw kidneys when I was doing the raw meat diet, because they're filtering urine, so they have a very like acrid, and when people cook kidneys at certain Chinese restaurants that have authentic menus, they'll have kidneys on the menu, and they soak those, I think, in something and wash them for a while to get a lot of that stuff out. I've been cooking a lot of tripe recently. So the stomach and intestines, and that's pretty easy. And I think that's pretty good because it's muscle, but it's kind of like, it's similar to heart. So heart and the intestine, the muscles around the actual gut lining, and then the muscles around them are sort of a cross between an organ and like a regular meat, because they have some secretory functions, and so they'll have a different nutrition profile that's a little bit more dense in some micronutrients than muscle meat, but they're also not as hardcore of a different texture and flavor as something like liver or kidneys. So that's kind of an in-between thing you can try.
That's cool. Well, actually, listeners would know I have a company called Nose to Tail, and we figure out ways to get organs into your diet in better ways. So yeah, we
Oh,
have a ground beef that has liver, heart, kidney, and spleen in it. So it's like all grass fed, grass finished, like good stuff from Texas. And then yeah, you can just eat it that way. Or we're doing these other livers like sticks. Have you heard of Drovors or biltong from South Africa?
biltong
Like
I've heard of.
yeah, Drovors is like a stick version. And we did a limited run of it. We put the liver and heart in the stick dried meat, and then it's kind of like a Slim Jim, but like without trash chemicals in it and weird stuff. It's just natural, air dried. So yeah, we're working on ways to get it in the diet in a sneaky way.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, so it sounds like your diet is pretty specific. You're acting like you have like no, but you're talking about avoiding seed oils. You're talking about avoiding fortified grains and not eating much bread and eating organ meats. So yeah, just keep going. Is there more to it? Like what, are you just more into whole foods, cooking for yourself, that type of thing? Like,
yeah. I'll eat, like I eat a decent amount of rice, actually, white rice, potatoes, and I tried oatmeal recently. This is just kind of a random observation, but oatmeal does not make me feel good. I don't know what that is.
Well, just a bunch of oats. I don't know. I don't think that's great for people.
I think I was talking to a friend about it, and I guess it's pretty high on the glycemic index. And usually you eat oatmeal by itself, whereas other starches tend to just in the culinary world go with a meat or a fat. So I do actually think that sometimes, because I'm usually skeptical of people that are skeptical of carbohydrates, but I think in some cases, eating a carbohydrate that is super high glycemically that you don't match with a protein or anything else to help process it, that can sort of cause some issues. But when I say my diet's not that specific, like I can go to a restaurant and eat something.
Yeah.
I'm not too picky. Like I don't have vegetable oil at home, but I won't not get something at a restaurant, even though it's probably cooked in vegetable oil.
Yeah. Well, my community doesn't appreciate this about me, but I'm in the same way where I can eat anything. I mean, it's not like I do it, but I can eat anything. Someone was commenting, "Oh my God, you ate jalapeno." I made like these jalapeno poppers, bacon and and how do you do that? Or you use spices, you use seasonings, or you go to a restaurant. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I am robust. I can handle these things. I don't want to be fragile. And many people, maybe because they have certain conditions, are more fragile and they can't eat certain foods. And I appreciate that. But I think the ultimate goal, it sounds like you went on a health journey, and even though you weren't unhealthy or you were never sick, but you kind of like swung back around to the ultimate goal of being metabolically flexible and being able to eat a variety of foods.
Yeah. After a while, when I was taking a lot of foods out of my diet, whether it was, raw vegan or when I was doing the raw meat, and if I would cheat on my diet, I would feel really crappy. And sometimes, you think to yourself, oh, well, that confirms that those foods are bad for you and that those foods are bad. But after a while, I started thinking, well, wouldn't it be kind of healthy, though, if you could like tolerate, a wider variety of things? And yeah, I know a lot of people have just really serious issues when they try to add this or that. And some people have to avoid something forever, like, whether it's like gluten or whatever. But yeah, I think my idea of what health has changed, because when I was younger and I really didn't have any health problems, but I just thought, oh, if I just find the perfect diet, I'll just live forever and I'll be healthy forever. And I don't know, some kind of abstract concept like that. But now I'm just like, well, I want to be able to live my life and feel good most of the time and be able to do the things I want to do and just normal stuff like that, and not develop some kind of debilitating disease, live like a much more modest sort of demands and goals out of it.
Well, I like that. But you did find these keystones to nutrition, though. Like if you're eating nutrient-dense organs and avoiding seed oils and doing all these things, you can have that flexibility. And I think that it should be people's ultimate goal. And I think a lot of people get stuck in dietary camps or have these like dogmatic views because they go too far, right? Or they're in a different part in their journey, where some people, like the people we brought up, if I avoid all carbs and sugar and I feel great and my diabetes went away, and then that's awesome. And you do that, and then you can get down to your goal weight. But then I see some people, I work with some patients and I partner with a doctor, and then people go too far on, say, a zero carb or carnivore, a very keto type of thing. And then their hormones get messed up, and we can start talking about, estrogen, hypothalamus hormones, stuff like that too. But they go too far, and then they're like, oh, this is bogus, everything's bad. And they swing another way. And then I just think that people need to know that there's different parts of your journey or different goals, and you need to eat diets based on different goals and your own body. And that I've gone through stages too. Yeah, it's like I took out all carbs, not all carbs, but I got really fat adapted, felt amazing. I was like fat adapted for, a year and a half, just great. And then but I had all the energy in the world. I could do anything. I did 3-hour workouts, training for a decathlon on almost no carbs or almost no food. Felt great. But then, maybe now I can add more carbs in and be more flexible or target them around a workout and feel good. So, well, that's one thing. And then also maybe an example, because you mentioned Ray Peat. So, I've been aware of him for years, and his ideas are kind of what you've been talking about, is avoid seed oils, you eat nutrient dense animal foods, but that, like, carbs or whole food or fruit or sugar or honey are actually not bad. And but yeah, it's just some of these people, like we interviewed the Strong Sisters. People may have heard of them on Instagram or whatever, on the Sapien podcast. So Sapien is another podcast I do with Dr. Gary. And they kind of went down that route. They went too hardcore. I feel like they messed up their hormones. They're younger girls or young women, not girls, 20s. And they got too skinny, I think, and just went too hardcore. Now they're very into this Ray Peat sort of thing. And maybe you could even explain what this whole Ray Peat idea is.
Yeah, well, it's such a mysterious thing because, the guy himself, he doesn't really curate his online presence. He writes he has had a website for a long time, and then for even longer, he had a newsletter, which I guess at some point went out in physical copies, and now it's something that you get in your email. And he just writes things, and it's actually, I mean, it gets really philosophical sometimes. He'll talk about nutrition and physiology in very abstract terms. And a lot of people like that. They like that style. But it makes it sort of tricky for what a Ray Peat diet is. Like, to some people, a Ray Peat diet is drinking, liters of orange juice and low-fat milk every day, oysters. There's a few like buzzwords in the community. Liver is a big one. Recently, mushrooms. Maybe like 5 years ago, he said, "Oh, mushrooms are good," and now everybody's eating mushrooms. But I guess the idea is centered on, if you're consuming a food and its macronutrient or micronutrient content or both are such, and it doesn't have anti-nutrients or toxins or whatever, or allergenic compounds that are maybe specific to people or maybe to everybody. And this food increases your metabolic rate. So one way you could look at that would be take your temperature before and after eating. And a healthy person who's eating foods that are supporting their metabolism, their temperature would go up. Usually you feel warmer after eating. If you don't feel warmer after eating, that's an indication of something bad, either that you have an issue with either digestion or your metabolism in general, your thyroid function, or that the foods you're eating are suppressing those things themselves. So that's the kind of main, I think, idea of the Ray Peat philosophy. But it gets pretty wacky. I mean, there's people taking a lot of exotic substances to try to block, say estrogen or serotonin because he'll write about how, oh, this hormone like serotonin, it's not really very good, serotonin signaling, and estrogen's not so great. Some people interpret that to mean that you don't want any of it, or similar to with cortisol, like that you don't want any of it, and if you can suppress that as much as possible. And I don't really agree with that. Pretty much every hormone, even when they're sort of considered bad, is needed at some level, sometimes cyclically. Like if you could actually cut out all of your estrogen, you would have serious issues, because there's certain cell signaling processes that require it. But yeah, I guess that's the overall framework.
Yeah, the way I understood it was pretty in line with some of the sapient ideas I have, but that sugar is not the enemy, I guess. And then I think that's where some of this context comes in too, is where are you in your journey? And I just want to know more about or your interpretation or take on it. And, you added these starches and carbs back in and feel better. And I know some people out there they do feel cold, or they do wake up in the middle of the night, or there's different things that have to do with cortisol or different hypothalamus or thyroid. And just if you could keep going on and that, and why you think it could be good to add back in sugar. Maybe it's fine to cut it out, and you did it and you cut out most carbs for years, right? Doing your all meat. And then like why it's good to come back around maybe.
Yeah. Well, one thing, the thyroid is actually pretty tied to carbohydrates in the sense that to have a real good functioning thyroid hormone, so the active thyroid hormone, most of it's made in the liver from converting the precursor hormone. So the thyroid gland itself makes a minority of active thyroid hormone, and most of it makes a precursor that's converted in the liver. And the liver, because the liver is sort of the main regulator of the whole body in that sense, it is the decider, I guess, of how much active thyroid you're going to have. So if the liver is sensing, because the liver picks up on what's going on in your blood, what's coming in from the digestive system, and all kinds of things, if it is picking up that you are, energy deplete, not getting a lot of stuff, it'll just naturally make less active thyroid hormone out of the precursor. So make less T3 out of the T4 that it's getting from the thyroid gland itself. And it seems to be, I've read several papers where the glycogen stores itself of the liver are one of the things that it uses to figure out how much T3 it's going to form from T4. So if you are chronically depleting your liver of glycogen and not replacing it, you should expect to have your thyroid function decrease over time and metabolic rate to go down in tandem with that a little bit. And often the slack of that will get picked up by the adrenal hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And they can keep things going, they can keep your body temperature up, even if your T3 is going down a little bit. But I think chronically, and this is why a lot of people do start to notice, feeling cold or starting to get things that people call adrenal fatigue, those kinds of symptoms. And it makes sense because by doing that, by signaling to your liver with, say, depleting it of glycogen chronically, that you don't use to not make as much thyroid hormone and to use that as the main sort of driver of metabolic rate, you fall back on the adrenal hormones to do that. So it makes sense that they would fatigue or whatever that's called. That's kind of a weird diagnosis, adrenal fatigue, because a lot of people, they'll get their cortisol taken at different times during the day, and it can be really inconsistent. Although I do think for sure, if you have chronically elevated cortisol, that's probably not a good thing. So yeah, that's the thyroid. It's almost like the thyroid gland is like in the thyroid gland and also in the liver. So you have to watch out for just understanding that endocrinology.
Well, yeah. So make it a little easier for people to understand, because some of these people, who go too low carb for too long are facing some of these problems. And some of it's from cortisol, and maybe too much fasting could be bad. And I love fasting. I mean, I don't actually do much fasting beyond 16 hours, which I don't really consider fasting, but maybe you would. I don't know. I don't know what you make of that. I mean, I'm not hungry until lunch, and then I eat a lot of calories for lunch and dinner, and then I'm fine until lunch again. So but yeah, what are these signs of maybe too much cortisol? Because I think I did used to wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, and my mind would be kind of racing. And I don't know. And I know other people including myself, have experimented with adding back in carbs at night, or had some honey or something, or like eat like a little ice cream or chocolate or something, as a classic dessert type of thing, and then feel better. And that's kind of what you said, right? The coffee shop, you had a bit of that sugar and felt better. So yeah, keep going on that kind of train.
Yeah. So waking up in the middle of the night, that's a really good sign that you're having some of these issues where, if you are seriously restricting carbs and then you go to sleep and your liver kind of switches over where it's like, okay, I'm switching from like a mixed, I'm putting out glucose into the blood for all the other tissues. And some of it is this stored glycogen that I have. And some of it is gluconeogenesis from converting protein into glucose, and then also relying on fatty acids. And when it gets kind of too much of a switch where the glycogen's fully depleted, then it'll just really turn up the cortisol a lot. And that's generally something that happens to wake people up. So the normal cyclical production of cortisol is that it's high in the morning, and it corresponds to when your liver starts to run out of glycogen, and it helps you wake up. So if that happens in the middle of the night, then it will tend to wake you up. And it can cause all kinds of things. People could have, feel stressed, hard to calm down and go back to sleep, heart racing, heart palpitations, and generally, so that's a really good sign. So like carbs before night could be good, and also salt, because the aldosterone system that monitors the salt, there's a lot of crosstalk between that and cortisol. So if you're low on salt, it will the same molecular processes to a lesser degree can be initiated as if you're low on carbs, and it causes kind of this stress thing where your body's like, oh, you should wake up and obtain these things that you need. What is it? Are people? What do people think about salt these days?
Everyone I know tries to get as much salt as possible.
Okay. Yeah, because for a while when I first got into the paleo thing, salt was considered bad.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah.
Okay. Because it's like it's kind of processed. So I think a lot of people thought it was bad.
Well, maybe. I mean, aside from like the mainstream dietary guidelines view that salt's bad, I think maybe some people maybe associate it with being bad because it's in a lot of processed foods or fast foods, and so kind of gets caught up in that. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I don't really have my finger on the pulse of what a lot of people are saying. But
salt's good. Salt's a good guy these days. So salt's
all right, good.
But some people are really successful doing carnivore, and I appreciate that and wish them well. And some people really feel great doing keto for long times, and some people, I don't know. Yeah, they do it for years. I mean, some people go overboard and then they like reverse. But yeah, just how do some people seem to do fine on it for long times?
That's a good question. I don't know. I've talked to a lot of people that did those types of things for a while and then hit some sort of wall and just all of a sudden kind of started feeling crappy. And that's when they discovered some of the ideas that suggested to them to add carbohydrates in and then all the other stuff. But that was the main difference for them. I guess that the simple answer would just be that it's kind of it sort of mimics like a deprivation state, like fasting. And there's a lot of debate about things like hormesis, and how some stress in this situation can make the body more resilient. And I think that there is a necessary stress that you have to give your body in order for it to perform, like even something simple, like in the case of exercise, exercise itself is a kind of stress to the body, even light exercise. And so that's the framework that I see something like restricting carbohydrates, or really restricting anything. But that's mostly what people are doing these days. And when the stress of that, I think there's a certain amount that people can deal with over time, and that if they keep going, it's not necessarily sustainable. Now, I do think I've heard of some people that have done it for decades and decades, but I do think that's a little rare. I think most people do it for a while, and then they tend to find a more moderate, vis-a-vis carbohydrate intake, long-term solution. So it seems to me like it's something that sort of draws on the reserves of the body. Maybe, liver function, like the liver can do it for a while, and you get a lot of immediate benefits because maybe you were eating something that, like some type of plant food that was allergenic to you, that was causing you issues, or the types of carbohydrates you were eating, maybe feeding bad bacteria, something like that, whatever the case may be. So you can get a lot of initial benefits. But I think for a lot of people, they kind of slowly just burn this like candle of their ability to do that. And it can get kind of dicey.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense. But is it definite that it's a stressful state? I mean, I know I hear people, I get a lot of just comments on my social media and haters and all this type of thing from different angles. There's always the vegan haters, but then there's the keto haters, and they're saying, oh, it's this stressful state. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I was doing pretty well for a couple of years, but I mean, I personally think it's better to have, some of these carbs back in. But I mean, is it truly a quote stressful state, or is that like, what is the evidence there?
Well, stress itself, that word it's kind of troublesome, because there are things that you could say are by definition stress, like anything that takes the organism out of homeostasis, that could be like sort of a working definition of just like the pure sense of stress. But when people use the term stress, they're usually using it in a connotation of bad, right? So, but I would say not all things, not all, food intakes, lifestyle things like exercise, all kinds of things, those things take your body out of homeostasis, in the sense that I don't think it would be good. This is actually a criticism I have of the Ray Peat world. Sometimes I feel like a lot of those people have an idea that the ideal state would be to be in like a bubble. With like
you're like floating in like 98.6 degree water, and
with like a high CO2 air and like an IV drip of constant glucose and like the perfect ratios of amino acids and vitamins and minerals, and like, just like red light, and never having to be stressed out about external factors like something you have to get done, or like a stressful situation in your life. And so you could call that a lack of stress. But in my opinion, that would actually be stressful for the organism, in the sense that we're not meant to not do anything and to not have challenges. One of the examples I like to give is, when astronauts are in low gravity, they have a lot of negative effects if they're in there for a while, like in a space station. They muscle atrophies, and even things in their blood chemistry will get bad. And you could say, oh, well, they have had the stress of Earth's gravitational field taken away, but that's not necessarily good. So when I say stress, in a literal sense, the hormonal state and the physiological state that switches on when you start doing more gluconeogenesis and more lipolysis to liberate free fatty acids for energy metabolism when you restrict carbs, that could be literally called stress, because those hormones like cortisol and the catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine in the adrenals, are just considered stress hormones. And they're also secreted during stress. So if you're scared, you're running away from somebody's trying to kill you or something, an animal's chasing you, you will also secrete those hormones. So you could say that it's literally stress, but some amount of those hormones being secreted in a cyclical fashion is probably good. It's definitely necessary. I mean, if you have the part of your pituitary gland that tells the adrenals to secrete hormones, if you have that damaged, you'll eventually die from vascular insufficiency, because the vascular tone just can't be kept up without a little bit of cortisol and epinephrine occasionally, because it signals all kinds of other things that just change the constriction and dilation of vessels and things that are necessary to keep the system going. Sort of like estrogen, it causes a lot of problems when it's chronically elevated, but it's necessary in small amounts. So the way I see it, if you are restricting carbs all the time, you are using chronically these stress hormones. And I would see that as a stressful state. And there's probably some length of time you can do it. It's different for everybody, where it wouldn't have like long-term negative effects. But I think there is a point at which it would start to have long-term negative effects.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's kind of consistent with what I had said in the beginning. Is I've seen people with Dr. Gary and these different people we work with, and once you get to a certain level, you don't need to keep doing it. But then I always like to bring in the part about there's a lot of mental side, right? We talked about psychological, the mental side to eating. I mean, I brought that up early for a reason, that I know many people who've come a long way. And then if they do try to bring back some whole food carbs even, or, I mean, honey is very sweet. They'll maybe go off the rails for weeks at a time and gain weight and just kind of fall apart. How do you think?
A lot of people do gain weight when they get into the repeat thing. That's undeniable. I mean, basically, if you give people a license to no longer, so people that were on a restrictive diet, and then you basically tell them that restrictive diet or any restrictive diet is just nonsense, and you'll be healthier if you just eat, a lot and try to get your metabolic rate up. Especially, they're not really ready for that. Like, if you haven't been eating carbohydrates, you can't just then go and eat, candy, and you can't overnight, because the hormonal state that you're in.
Oh yeah. Well, assuming someone did it properly. I know what you mean. Your metabolism is not ready. You're in the fat burning mode, and you're not very ready for the carbs. But I mean, it's almost telling people to just go back to eat the standard American diet again.
Well, the standard American diet, I mean, I guess they switched from the food pyramid to My Plate, right? That was like 10 years ago or something. That thing is kind of silly. It's kind of half mainstream, not the best nutritional science, and then half like agricultural input
influence
from food producers. So it's not necessarily, I feel like you could get to a few different conclusions of what specifically to eat as an individual. And what's most important to me is the premise that you start with. Because if the premise you start with is, I'm just going to eat what it says on, the food guide, whatever, My Plate, that's like a crappy premise, because they don't really have your best interests in mind for that. And somebody online that's telling you eat an extreme diet may also not have your best interest in mind. So right off the bat, you should start with like, okay, what are my goals? Like, if you have some type of health condition, that's a different starting point than if you're normal, healthy, and you just want to be like, okay, I want to go a little bit above and beyond normal people who don't really think about what they're eating to get a little bit more out of my body, be healthier longer, into older age and stuff like that. you could make some small changes that would actually look quite a bit different than the standard American diet, but also wouldn't look crazy, like, I mean, a lot of things have been normalized, like vegetarianism, but that's actually really extreme if you think about it. So what people consider extreme and normal is
relative.
Yeah, and it's dictated by these ideas, and some of them are bad.
Yeah.
So like the veganism and even just vegetarianism is pretty extreme. If you have the view that seems like the reasonable view, which is that animal products and meat have been part of the human diet for pretty much forever, and there's not a whole lot of evidence, of peoples that have sustainably lived without them. The standard American diet thing, I mean, I don't really do too much of telling people what to eat anymore and like big dietary changes. What I like to do is ask people what they're eating, what they like, and then offer little changes. Because when I changed big things, even that itself, even if you were going from a crappy diet to a good diet, sometimes a rapid change itself can cause health problems, whether it's like a really big change for your gut and the microbiome there, or if let's say that you do best on 30 or 40% calories from carbs, and right now you're at 0. Going from 0 to that isn't necessarily the best idea to do overnight. I don't know. So yeah, I stick to saying like, okay, well, don't eat vegetable oil because you don't have to, and try to cook things at home. And even the thing like, so when talking about like meat and stuff and the nose to tail and all that, the question of amino acid profile, I think, is pretty interesting, because these days, when people eat meat, they just go, oh, I eat meat. And so they think that that's kind of, oh, I'm getting everything I need because I eat meat. But specifically collagen, and then also organs that have slightly different amino acid ratios than muscle meat. Even just something as simple as, adding organs into an otherwise normal diet and adding things that have collagen, like making broths out of joint cuts, or just taking supplemental collagen or whatever, that can make a really big difference. And it also makes sense from the perspective, a more paleo perspective, because so our bodies are made up of pretty much the same meat as animals, and we have to make muscle, we have to make organs, and we have to make skin and all the connective tissues and everything. So wouldn't it make sense to just consume all of those parts to get, because assuming those parts have different compositions, which they do, then, why would you expect to have an optimal situation trying to build a whole body with all the different parts by just eating the stuff that's in like the muscle meat?
Or just a bunch of leaves or something, or fruit.
Right. Because from the perspective of a vegetarian, meat is meat, right? And but it's so much more than that. Like people, I mean, that's a new thing to just eat muscle meat. Even that is kind of a radical change. Like people out of economic necessity used to have to eat the whole animal, or at least substantially more of it than now.
Oh, even 70 years ago, they were doing that.
Right. And that's an easy change. I mean, all it really takes, it sucks that some people are so picky, with eating. And you're saying like you have the ground meat thing, and hopefully that works for a lot of people. But like you can go, there's like French restaurants, that will serve organs and different types of things. And it's really good. I mean, there's a lot of culinary traditions that have unfortunately been lost, especially in the American context of like the consumer culture, having things fast, not having an emphasis on like family and cooking and like an ethnic tradition. Like say, there's ethnic traditions from all the different sub-ethnicities of Europe that came over here of organ dishes and stuff like that. And that's been very downplayed, in the kind of like melting pot situation. So I think really just exploring that stuff in and of itself is, and it's fun, you try something, you might like it. Like a lot of people like tongue is tongue is a muscle, but it's a little bit different than the skeletal muscles, and a little bit different nutritionally. And a lot of people really like that. Or if you go to a taco place, like a really authentic taco place, they'll have tongue, tripe a lot of times, and sometimes brains.
Yeah, the cabeza, the head, the whole head and stuff. They have all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Right. So I think people like, if you want to make a change like that, and like it doesn't have to be like a dour slog of like, well, okay, now it's time to take my medicine, like it could be like a sort of a fun thing, like rediscovering a more traditional and historical relationship with food and with the culinary traditions of like your own ancestry and things like that. So you could put a positive spin on this stuff.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, like pate, like a French, I mean, the pate is good. Or I think my crowd is kind of into that. And it is, you can make it delicious. You can wrap liver and bacon. You can do all kinds of stuff. But I guess you're kind of saying, you kind of are talking, I always try to bring it back to the Sapien diet, Sapien framework, just because it's fun to do and it's my thing. But you're saying you don't have to make extreme dietary changes, but you can edge toward that Sapien way of eating by just shifting away from the vegetable oils. Then that's if you lose the vegetable oils, you lose most of processed foods, right? And then you're kind of just left with a pretty good whole foods diet. And then you're saying, then, okay, now let's just move it a little more towards the nose to tail side and get the organs. And now we're sitting pretty.
Yeah. You'd be surprised, like when you cut something out like vegetable oil, or you just make a decision like, okay, I'm going to eat the vast majority of stuff that, I'm going to home cook things and try to be really in control of all the stuff that goes into the diet. Like it makes you more creative, and it's actually, it's rewarding in and of itself, even outside of the health aspect, because it's just, I don't know, it kind of sucks like being dependent on, like if you go somewhere and you want to eat something and, you just have to like look at the ingredients and they're just always so crappy. And it makes you feel like, the people making these foods, like they must really hate me, not respect me at all. It's just kind of a bad situation.
I think so. And yeah, I mean, I just really love to cook at home now, but good stuff, man. We're kind of getting to the end here. Is there any other things I kind of want to ask about just, nutrition research in general? I kind of mentioned that in the beginning, that we could wrap back around to that. And so maybe you could talk about just some problems with nutrition science in general. And I think there's problems, and I think you do as well, with just nutrition science around fat, because it's always bringing along the PUFAs, right? Or like, all this science has been done, or we're just a sick population we're studying. So there's two sides. There's like research in general and why it's bad, to do with specifically with like, say, PUFAs.
Yeah. One of the big parts of my dissertation, the background. So when you write your dissertation, you have sort of like the introduction part, which is your best attempt at a comprehensive literature review of the subject that you're trying to add to with your experiments. So it involves, ideally you would read just a ton of papers, everything that's related to the question that you're asking, and try to get a really good grasp of what's going on in that field, so that you don't just do the same thing over again, or you don't make simple mistakes. Like if there's a way to do an experiment and this has been figured out by other people, all kinds of things. And it helps you figure out where the holes are in the science that I could address this, I could address that. And one thing that I found consistently, almost to the point that it was ridiculous, was, well, for one, and I think it's changing now, and I haven't really been keeping up with, like in the last few years, nutrition papers that look at high fat diets. But for the longest time, and probably still fairly consistently now, they just use lard, commercial lard, which, like I said, has a lot of basically vegetable oil, because pigs are like humans. We store the fats that we eat. Unlike, ruminant animals like cows and the kind that have the four-stomach setup. So if you feed a pig vegetable oil sources, it will have.
It reflects that in the fat.
Right.
I actually have to throw this in too, because another thing we do at Nose to Tail is we specifically feed our pigs and chickens a special diet so that they have a very low omega-6 diet and the low omega-6 fat. And we did the lab analysis, and it's like very, very low. It's like close to 1-to-1.
Okay. Yeah. So in the average nutritional experimental diet for rodents or whatever kind of animals, usually mice and rats, they'll just say, oh, I want a high fat diet. And then they'll get this lard diet. And for whatever reason, well, I guess because people consider, like, the average person just thinks, oh, animal fat, so that has a lot of saturated fat. Mm-hmm. And these scientists will also have that basic idea. And so in some cases, they'll even report incorrectly. They'll say, oh, we used a high saturated fat diet. And then what I would do when I was going through this literature is I would go to the methods and look and see exactly what the experimental diet they used was, find as much, a lot of times they just list out and they'll actually analyze it. Sometimes it'll say the product and you have to go to a website of a manufacturer and then they'll have an analysis, but it's never a high saturated fat diet because it's always pig lard. And sometimes it's even pig lard mixed with, some type of vegetable oil or whatever, I guess was cost effective or for the processing. And so usually they'll just blame it on the saturated fat, because kind of like how, cholesterol is blamed for heart disease, even though there's a lot of things that you could say are causing it. It's just people have accepted that it's causing it. So they'll have an experiment and they'll show, oh, look, this high fat diet caused diabetic-like symptoms in rats. So it's the saturated fat. And they won't even bother to do some type of control group or other treatment group that has the same amount of fat, but without, the high PUFA component. And there's just hundreds of papers like that just claim they're not actually asking the question, is saturated fat causing this problem? They're asking the question, is the type of fat we used in our experiment causing this problem? And they don't even really discuss exactly what the components are. And sometimes they even report it factually incorrectly, which, maybe I should, because you can get papers retracted if people make it.
Wow, that'd be cool if you got some paper retracted.
Because there was one that just made a mathematical mistake. Well, there was one that said the diet was 60% saturated fat, like 60% of the calories came from saturated fat. But in reality, it was 60% of the calories were fat. And of that, it was only like less than a third of that total. Mm-hmm. So the actual percentage was like 20 or so percent of the calories from saturated fat. But they reported it as 60% saturated fat diet. And it was just a mistake. I guess they figured it was a high saturated fat diet because it was lard and it was 60% fat. So somebody just mixed it up. But that's like a pretty big mistake. And then somebody else reads that and uses that in their paper to support and it just kind of does this whisper down the lane thing where everybody just goes, oh, high fat causes this, especially saturated, when it's exactly the opposite. At least in my opinion, saturated fat is the least responsible of the fats for these issues that it's being blamed as the most responsible for.
That's a huge problem. Yeah, I've never heard of people talking about the specific issue you're talking about, is the misreporting of the types of fats in the diet. And it goes along with that bigger issue I mentioned where there's just a bias in science, and our current belief is saturated fat is bad. So, of course, this is just a saturated fat. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like, this is what a lot of science, it happens like this kind of on accident because of the paradigms we have, right? You just think, well, I see them just assuming they do, right?
Yeah. Even outside of whether they're making the kind of mistakes I'm talking about, if a scientific field presupposes that something causes a problem and looks for that to cause a problem, you're more likely to find that it causes a problem, right? Like if you assume something and look for it, you're more likely to find it than if you enter the question without that assumption,
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yes.
Yes.
That's a better way to put it, is that, yes, we believe this, and then we're setting up these experiments, and then people just be like, oh yeah, of course. And then they didn't realize they were affecting the experiment, or didn't even report the data correctly.
Right. When actually, I mean, when you take a basic science course and they explain the scientific method, the classical way you're supposed to do it is to try to invalidate your sort of like null hypothesis. So if you were really doing a strict science qua science experiment, you would say, okay, everybody is saying, in the literature that saturated fat causes this issue. And then design an experiment specifically to try to challenge that, instead of designing it to try to replicate and confirm that. It's supposed to be done the former way, but it never is, because the bias in science is to get published. And there's just a lot of calculations that people make for things that are publishable. You want to get results that look impressive, using even like the statistical methods people choose to use. Like some of them kind of make the differences look bigger. And there's all kinds of things that go into it that don't quite add up to fraud per se, but are just like these tiny little decisions that people make, perhaps even subconsciously, because they know it'll be more likely to get their papers published, which will then lead to just benefits in their career overall over time.
Yeah, well, it's natural, and they need funding, and everyone wants to progress and succeed, and it's a huge problem. Also, in 2021, it seems like challenging your opinion is almost a bad thing. People are it's at an all-time high or low, you could say. No one does it. Everyone wants to be in their safe space with their safe opinions. And if you challenge the narrative, you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah. I would be interested to see brain scans of people, and like over time when they think about issues and like what parts of the brain light up. Cause I would suspect actually we've gone through, over the past few decades, whether people are talking about the diets they do, their politics, their like social ideas, health, lifestyle, whatever, there's probably more like fear and just things sort of associated with like threat salience parts of the brain that would light up these days when these things are brought up than maybe in times past when people weren't so like emotionally tied to, maybe a diet that they think is like the one true diet that's best for humans or whatever it is.
Yeah, people are triggered by a lot these days, and I use the term snowflake in a post, and some people even just got freaked out that I use a snowflake. They're like, "You can't. Why are you calling people snowflakes? Just like you were being a snowflake." I mean, yeah, we're at the all-time high of this, and I think I went on someone else's podcast today, and I was talking about the biggest problem we have is not looking at both sides. I think that across the board is we are too afraid to look at other people's opinions or try to disprove yourself, like you're saying the scientific method should. And for better or for worse, that's why I talk about a more general sapient framework where there's not one way to do it. So now I haven't boxed myself into a corner by thinking that there's only one way to eat. So then I'm not triggered if someone has a different opinion, and I will talk to all different people because I'm not boxed in. And so whatever this Ray Peat thing is, I'm like, okay, that kind of makes sense because, we're eating nutrient dense foods, we're, this and that. And it does work. So I don't know. I just think people should, not be so, I guess, tied to their beliefs and look at both sides. And that's how you progress.
Yeah. And also the stress that people are giving themselves. Like I can only imagine somebody writing a really upset comment that even it's very possible that that mind state that they find themselves in often when they're challenged is actually more detrimental to their health than like if they weren't on such an optimal diet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like kind of ironic. Like they're so mad that somebody doesn't agree with them about what's healthy. They're harming their health by being obsessed with being angry about it.
I believe it. And I think some people are too stressed out about just keeping with their restrictive diet that's stressing them out too much. Right? If people just relax a little and realize that once a month they could eat something different, they'd be okay.
Yeah, I spent a ton of time when I was on extreme diets. Like I would drive hours to get to a farm that had like grass-fed raw milk or whatever. And, you know, maybe that's a great food and it was good that I was drinking it, but maybe it wasn't like worth exactly that much trouble. I mean, it's really hard to calculate, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or freaking out about it. Yeah. I know people that just won't touch it if it's not perfect. And yeah. Okay. Anyway, thanks so much. Good talk here.
Yeah.
Do you have any, I don't know if you have like social media, or I guess you have a YouTube channel. Where do we want to send people?
My YouTube channel is Nutrichronology. So it's a portmanteau of nutrition and endocrinology. So the first 5 letters of nutrition and UTRI. Mm-hmm. And then the part of chronology, like endocrino without the ENDO of endocrinology.
Cool. I'll link to it, and good stuff, man. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it was fun.
Okay, there we go. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing with a friend. Thanks for giving a review on iTunes or any podcast app. It really helps us spread the word and bump up our cred. Nosetail.org for the biltong, the beef tallow body care products, the seasonings, which I use every day, the artwork, handmade in the UK from Yuli, sent to you, and all the fresh meat items. Also sapien.org for the program and the tribe. You can link to everything there, including the film Food Lies, still on Indiegogo. Really appreciate people still pre-ordering the film there. Thanks for the support. We're working on it daily. See you next week.